There we go. Okay. Kip Robinson Greenthal has dedicated her career to the written word, storytelling, and literary endeavors. She holds a BA in English Literature and Creative Writing from Sarah Lawrence College, where she studied with Grace Paley. For 18 years, she worked as a librarian in schools and public libraries. And I just found out this morning that she worked at the Lopez Library in the early 80s. So yay, and thank you, Kip. In 1993, she became the education director for Seattle Arts and Lectures and founded and directed the award-winning Writers in the Schools program there.
Wayne.
Throughout her working years, Kip always wrote. She was selected for the Jack Straw Writers program and awarded a Hedgebrook residency. Her short story, Tattoo Emporium, was published in Secret Histories, Stories of Courage, Risk, and Revelation in 2013, and has appeared in Currents, an anthology published by the Lopez Writers Guild in 2004. And in 2007, in January, the Washington State Poet Laureate Elizabeth
Now it says mute my audio.
Selected her short story Stealing to air on KUOW's On the Beat. The novel we are celebrating tonight, her first novel, Shoal Water, won the 2020 Landmark Prize for Fiction, sponsored by Homebound Publications. And the story takes place in Nova Scotia, where Kip lived for 12 years, which is something I did not know about you, Kip. Tonight, after Kip shares a few passages from her novel, she will be joined by another local author and Kip's friend, Iris Gravel, for an interview and then audience Q&A. And you can look forward to an author talk by Iris next spring when her new book, Writer in a Life Vest, comes out. So once again, thank you all for coming here to celebrate Kip. And please join me in congratulating her and welcoming her.
Thank you, Malia. Thank you so much. It was really fun to come in and see you today at the Lopez Library and surprise you with the news that I worked at the Lopez Library in the mid-'80s. Sandra Shugren founded the library, and then I had the good fortune of working with my dear friend who's no longer with us, Ollie Smalters. So that was very special to have those years there. And a book can't come out without my expressing gratitude, my huge gratitude to all the libraries, nationally, worldly, globally, to the Lopez Island Library, to Malia Sanford for hosting and her staff who works so hard. And also my gratitude to Leslie Browning, who chose Shoal Water for the Landmark Prize and offered me a contract to be published. And I know a number of you are here tonight who wondered if that would ever happen. So coming into the library today and just seeing Malia was very special. And I want to shout out a huge gratitude to Iris Gravel, who convinced me to apply for the Landmark Prize. My friend who's kind of held my hand doing social media, Facebook, and she's here tonight to be with me in conversation. Thank you, Iris and Malia. So I guess what I'll do is I will start with kind of a broad, synopsis of the book. And then I'm going to read from 3 different writers' points of view. And I will tell you first my little synopsis. The disillusioned by the Vietnam War and troubled by their own past, Kate and Andy in 1971 leave New York City for a remote Nova Scotia fishing village where Andy spent summers as a child to build a new future. As Kate and Andy settle into this barren Atlantic community and start a bookstore and raise a family, they discover the problems of their own, past are mirrored in the unrest of the locals who are grappling with change as modern technology threatens their traditional fishing livelihood. In their shared sense of place, Kate and Andy's lives become inextricably linked with the fate of Ivan, Will, and Lena, Nova Scotians, and an unexpected love triangle, a tragic accident, and alcoholism capsizes their future. I thought what I'd do is start with a part from the book that explains where the title came from, Shoal Water. So I'll read this to you first, and then we can have questions moderated by Iris and Malia. Andy remembered standing on the deck of Carl's boat that first summer, dressed in Ivan's two big oilskins. It was the most beautiful morning Andy had ever seen, with the cove and the dark air and the magenta light, dawn a pink line over the horizon. Even at 13, Andy knew that going out fishing in the early Nova Scotia morning was remarkable. "Welcome to your first fishing trip now, Andy," Carl yelled out. But Andy knew that Ivan was not welcoming him. They slid past the black rocks out onto the swell of the ocean. Out on the water, things hadn't gone that easily. He'd found it hard to balance on deck. When he fell across the engine box, Ivan dismissed Andy with a look. But Carl had given him the wheel and shown him how to keep the Lena's bow lined up with the point of land while Ivan busied himself with the line. So just to interject, I want to just refresh you all. Andy has spent his childhood summers in Slate Harbor, where Ivan, who is native to the village, lives. Ivan deeply resents Andy because his parents bought and remodeled an old deserted house in the village that Ivan loved to retreat to when his drunken father made his life miserable. Carl, Ivan's uncle, wants Ivan to be kinder to Andy, and with this in mind, Carl invites Andy to go on his first fishing trip along with Ivan. The boys are 13 years old. "The tide's flooding, so we'll haul down with it. We'll reset the nets down from the shoals, Carl said. Shoals, a word Andy had never heard before. A buoy bobbed ahead of them. Carl took over and slowed the Lena, and Ivan ran forward and leaned far out to grab it and slipped the bow line through. Andy knew he'd never move with the same coordination. Carl cut the engine. The wind had died, and morning light shone through the green sweet sea and swayed him. He remembered leaning over the gunwale to see the anchor line angling mysteriously down into the deep, and he felt as though he were glimpsing something primeval. The stern swung around, and a mass of silver fish flickered in the net. Something interrupted. Something was attacking the fish in their nets. "Damn seal," Carl called out, grabbing a spike pole and racing to the stern. Cursing, he took aim. Small whirlpools whipped up by the float line, and Carl jabbed at them with the pole. "What is it?" Andy asked, surprised. "They eat fish," Ivan said. A shining black head rose in the water, looked right at Carl. The seal's whiskers flickered in the sun, its black eyes watery like a dog's. Andy had never seen one so close before, something looking so benevolent rising from the sea. Carl aimed his pole right between its eyes. "Carl, don't!" Ivan screamed. The seal disappeared. "Why the hell not, you? Don't kill it." Ivan's voice was steady. Everything grew silent then, even the movement of the sea as Andy stood with his feet planted to the deck, relieved by Ivan's outburst. Carl dropped the pole by his head. "What's gotten into you, Ivan?" "It's bad luck," Ivan said, looking out over the water. And Andy looked out too, fearing he might see the creature's body flowing with its warm blood on the ocean. but there was no sign of him. Since when is it bad luck? Carl spat into the water, wiping his mouth. It's just a feeling, Ivan said, looking away. And he pictured the seal underwater somewhere, down close to the seafloor, maybe 25 feet beneath the Lena. He imagined it escaping over the reef, darting for a different current. Well, Andy, get your gloves, boy. We're going to show you how to pick herring. He got his gloves then, wrestled his fingers inside them. Ivan came up and pulled the rope, and Andy joined him. They hauled the net, with herring trapped and tangled by their gills. So this is how you shake fish now, Andy, Carl said. He shook the net, and the fish slithered onto the deck. He didn't know if it was the sea swell or the smell of fish, but suddenly he was dizzy and retching over the rail. Shit, weak, pathetic. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. He knew Ivan saw him, but Carl seemed not to notice. His throat was in knots while the boat rocked and seawater ran down his aching arms and fish scales smeared his gloves and jacket. But he stood up again and picked and pitched the fish into boxes. Your oilskins aren't looking so stiff now, Ivan said, and looked at him for the first time that morning. Later, when they'd finished cleaning up, they let the Lena drift while they sat eating sandwiches and passing a flask of rum back and forth. The sun was hot on their shoulders, and the alcohol made Andy float. Seasickness is part of becoming a fisherman, Carl said, then reset his cap over his wiry gray hair. You'll get stronger. The sun cast showers of light in their eyes. Carl looked over at him. I'm going to tell you something, Carl said. It's about a dream I've had all my life. It's about the shoals that wake me up in the dead of night. What are the shoals? Andy finally asked. The shallows, Carl said, where the seafloor comes up just beneath the surface of the sea. You can't see them really, and you sure as hell try to stay off them. But the rich fishing ground lies right there. Carl took a swig of rum. I'm coming in from fishing, see, he said, but I can't tell west from east, north from south, because the points of my compass don't register. I try to find the markers for the shoals, but the sky's as black as the sea and I can't see nothing. I know the shoals are coming like a man can smell the warmth of another human being when his eyes are closed. But the difference is my eyes are wide open. The boat pitches beneath me, and I know I've come in by the shoal water. Fear, that's what I call the shoal water. Fear that you run aground and let the sea break over you. I figure that shoal water is inside me, that fear. If I can feel the shallows coming in time, I can right myself and get through them. Andy took another swig of rum, and looking over at Ivan, he wasn't afraid to look at him for the first time.
Thank you, Kip. What a dramatic way to open the book and the evening. And I just want to add my congratulations to you, Kip, on this accomplishment. And thanks to the library for this opportunity for all these local folks who have been cheering you on and eagerly awaiting this beautiful novel to show up. We're up to almost 80 people, probably more than that, because some of these little boxes have more than one person. So the hometown crew has really turned out, and some of them have zoomed in from far away also to be with you tonight. I'm so glad that the picture of the cover was on the screen as you were reading that excerpt, Kip, because the shoal water and the seal are such prominent characters and themes in the book. So it was great to have that image in front of us as you were reading, especially about the seal. And those of you who haven't read the book yet, you'll see what a prominent role the seal plays. I just want to back up a little bit to ask what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Well, thank you, Iris. It was not the seal, believe it or not. I feel like the seal came in when I started writing the book to kind of guide me and help me along. What inspired me, interestingly, was an accident that I heard about when I was working in the Lunenburg Library in Nova Scotia out at sea. And it was an accident where a father who was alcoholic, had significant drinking problems, took his boy out, and he was in the Cape Island boat, and he left the cover of the engine box off. And a major wave just hit the boat, and the boy was knocked into the engine and killed him. And this accident really possessed me. And I wasn't quite sure why. I have had in my own life experience of alcoholism, and I think that probably had something to do with it. But that accident led me on a journey. I wanted to kind of fictionalize it. I wanted to learn about the characters who might have been in the inshore fishing community, who knew about it. And also the two Americans, Andy and Kate, who came to the inshore fishing community in Slate Harbor to live. So I had to do a lot of character study. I had to learn who my characters are. I'm putting it in present tense because they still are very much present with me. And that took a lot of time. And it's interesting how, so I guess they always say a novelist is either plot driven or character driven or major event driven. I would say I was major event character driven to write this book, even though really the accident is totally different from the actual accident that happened.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the characters because they are so real and they're complicated. They all have important roles. They have strengths. They have struggles. And as I read the book, I felt so much compassion for them, even though sometimes some of them did things that were maddening and that I knew were not good choices. You wrote them with such compassion. It really came through in them. So I would like you to talk just a little bit more about how you developed them. What goes into that process of developing these fictional characters?
I would say it's layers. First, you get your main characters, and then you try to figure out where they live, where they grew up, what they wear, where they work, what their pasts have been, how they've been influenced by their parents. I would say my biggest job was to feel like I could do that, be honorable to them as real people. I didn't want stick figures. I didn't want one character to be purely good, one character to be purely bad. I was trying to create characters who were multidimensional, who could be loved, but also they could have Achilles heels that were very challenging. I also wanted to write about friendship. All the characters are friends in the book. And that was part of the challenge for them as they lived close together and shared their lives together, as is revealed in the unexpected love triangle that comes out. It wasn't anything they were seeking. It befell them, and they struggled with it as friends. And so that took me time. I had to really spend some time not just having, Andy, who's struggling with alcohol, be the bad guy, and Kate, be the good girl. And it's complex. I think it's why it took me so much time. Yeah. And of course, I did take some time away from the book, and I think that helped me when I worked at Seattle Arts and Lectures to take a 10-year break, because then when I came back to visit them, I think I had more maturity in a way to face them and to really think about them.
Well, I think that all of that, getting to know those characters and the time that you took certainly paid off, because that's how I experienced them too. So why don't we hear from another one of them? You were going to read some
Okay.
excerpts from different characters' points of
Good.
view, and I don't know who's up next.
I think I'll bring Kate up next. And I had a longer passage that I was going to read, but I think I'll read a shorter one so we can have more conversation. And this is after Kate has lived in Nova Scotia with Andy for about a year and a half, 2 years, and she's pregnant. And the women of Slate Harbor are throwing a shower for her. So here she is from New York City in a whole new cultural setting. Ladies dressed in their best were gathered in the center of the room, all eyes on Kate. Balloons floated from the ceiling. Surprise! Kate, now 8 months pregnant, had come for her weekly knitting lesson with Lena. Lena's Ivan's mother. Only last week she'd stopped working at the harbor house. Come in, dear, Lena murmured, smiling. You know most of us. Outside, the temperatures were still cold in April, the inlet of Slate Harbor beginning its ice melt. Kate took off her boots and coat and followed Lena through the kitchen. She recognized most of these women from the quilting circle. Verlene was the first to come up. Oh, Kate, what fun this is. Her brown eyes roamed Kate's belly, and she laughed. You look so ready. You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble, Kate said, worrying about Verlene. Verlene is Ivan's wife. Over the last few months, when she and Andy played bridge with Verlene and Ivan, she'd go into the kitchen with Verlene to get tea and cake, and Verlene would confide that she still wasn't pregnant. Come over and sit here, Lena said, now taking Kate to the high-backed chair decked with braids of white and yellow crepe paper. Kate sat down on the chair's soft cushion. A table to her right was stacked with presents wrapped in pastel colors and Baby Farrell written on the cards. A din of whispering voices. Sitting on her crepe paper throne, Kate looked across the room at Verlene, the youngest besides herself. She wished Verlene might get pregnant so they could have a baby at the same time. She wondered why she might not be fertile and studied her tight blonde curls and round thighs beneath her daisy print dress, wondering if something was wrong. Was she romantic enough or even reckless enough in Ivan's bed? Verlene smiled at Kate, who blushed, self-conscious that she was imagining her friend making love with Ivan. She shouldn't be thinking this way, knowing some part of her was imagining herself and not Verlene with Ivan. Are you hoping for a boy or a girl, dear? One woman asked. Oh, Andy and I will be happy with either one. And how do you like living in the house? Her tone sounded suspicious. Oh, I do enjoy it. They're talking about the Tannard house. Another woman leaned in. You must feel lonely out there all by yourself. Sometimes I do. And Andy's working with Sherman Smith is going well all right at the dory shop? Yes. But Andy's a man with an excellent education. Building dories is a fine craft, Kate defended. Is your father coming when the baby's born? My father, I think so. And Andy's mother, someone else whispered. Kate grew hot in the fishbowl with these women. Their voices whirled around her. She rubbed the back of her neck and turned to look out the window where the light blazed. Kate? It was Verlene, pointing towards a cake with Kate's name in the middle of it. Kate looked at Verlene as if she were seeing her for the first time. Verlene, who was certain of who she was in this community, with her mother right here in this room and her grandmother before that. Verlene would never think to move away from here the way Kate had moved away from New York. Across the room, Verlene and Lena prepared the lunch, stacking lobster sandwich wedges, cheese slices along fresh white bread, arranging celery and carrot sticks, the refrigerator cookies, and the big white icing cake with her name in the middle. Almost painfully, Kate missed Lizzie, her friend in New York, and now yearned for Verlene to be her best friend. After all, they shouldn't just play bridge together. They needed to see each other more often without Andy and Ivan and form their own friendship. Why it had taken her so long to realize this? Perhaps Verlene could help her organize all the baby clothes she was getting at the shower, she thought, as she began to open her presents, the tiny booties, the miniature ribbed sweater with the lacy border, the diapers, the flannel receiving blankets, and the small patchwork quilts. How could these ladies give her such beautiful things when they seemed, did she dare say this, a bit mean? Verlene could help her understand these things. This would be natural since Ivan and Andy were best friends, and this could solve her deepest worry. If Verlene were hers, she would never be tempted to betray her. Verlene came over to pass the presents in the open boxes around for everyone to see, her face bathed in daylight from the living room window, Carl flushed cheeks, her dense brown eyes. Kate leaned towards her. We need to see each other more often, Verlene, she said, just the two of us. Verlene blushed. Oh, yes. You know, sometimes my hair appointments don't last all day. I could come visit you before Andy comes home. And don't worry about your presents, Kate. Lena and I will plan to bring them over. Afterward, walking back along the path to the Tannard house, the wind swept about her feet while she folded her hands over her belly. Verlene will be my friend, she thought, feeling more prepared now to have a baby in this wild, remote place.
Thank you. A great example of how you weave these characters in and the detail. I would venture to say that probably most everybody in the audience tonight has been in one of those scenes. And you reveal a lot about those women and really make it come to life. I just want to remind people that if questions come up for you as Kip is reading, feel free to type them into the chat, and between Malia and I will sort through those and get your questions to Kip. So you don't have to wait until she's finished reading to start getting those into the chat. But I get to ask a few more questions first. So we talked about what inspired you to write Shoal Water and about the characters. I'm curious about when you knew how the novel was going to end. You know, I write nonfiction and I know how things end because they're true. But as a novelist, you get to make up the ending. And I'm always intrigued to hear from novelists about when they know and how they know what the ending will be. So what was that like for you with Shoal Water?
That's a great question, Iris. I would say Shoal Water in its various different versions had different endings. So it's about the drafts and the endings that kind of take you through. And, you know, it's interesting. So what I had to do in writing all these revisions, my first big one was really a lot of stories about the Nova Scotians and a lot of stories about Kate and Andy, and I had to weave them together. And my agent, Anne Depew, said, you know, this really is a story about an American coming to an inshore fishing community in Nova Scotia. And I realized, oh yeah, that was my experience. And as a writer, I needed to have that authentic voice. Yes, it was me who came to Nova Scotia, but I'm not Kate. Kate is a collage of many different people. But it helped me to understand that it would be best for the novel to start with that, because it gave me that kind of curve, that arc that I needed to weave all the characters together. So once I did that, the ending kind of came to me. It was almost like an epiphany in a way. And I realized it really was about a young woman in her 20s who was struggling, confused, um, trying to make the best of her decision to make this big, huge leap to go with Andy in a truck to Nova Scotia. She fell in love with the place and she loved the people in the inshore fishing community. So I really wanted the story, in spite of some of the very hard parts of it, I wanted the young people to go through the hardship of what a lot of us go through in our 20s. It's a very confusing time for many of us. I'm speaking personally because I did go through the Vietnam War experience, and that definitely informed me. But I wanted to end the book on a hopeful note, and that's where the seal comes in. The seal is actually, from my point of view, an act of grace that happens in the story. At those hardest moments, the seal will appear. And that's what led me to the ending. I wanted to end with that sense of hope, even though very difficult things happened within the story itself.
Yes, that is a fine dance that I think you navigated well, of the realness of people's lives and the hardships, and still maintaining that sense of hope. You did that beautifully. So let's hear from another one of your characters.
Okay.
Because there are some really good questions coming into the chat, so I want to be sure that we get those too. But
all right. So I'm going to read from Ivan's point of view, the Nova Scotian. It was an overcast September morning, and Ivan drove across the bridge and along the road to the tire plant, seeing Kate's face in his mind all the while, the four of them playing bridge last night, sitting around the table at the Tannert house. He parked in the lot beside the large, dreary buildings and took a deep breath, trying to wipe out that unsettled feeling, bracing himself for the sound of machines and tire building drums, the smell of rubber. He made his way to the office in the metal tasting air, his job to make sure those steel monsters spitting out wire and metal shells and casings worked all right. Not always easy. He wasn't sure why he hated his job so much. Ivan punched in his time card, hung his jacket on the hook. Men in goggles and gloves worked at the various machines, spinning out rubber steel cords, the roar of production. He'd felt jealous of Kate at first. For years, when Andy came to Slate Harbor, as a kid, it was just the two of them. They'd fish in the dory, help Carl repair nets, or work on the Cape Islander, go drinking in Greenport. That's how they'd become best friends. Going to his desk, he opened the notebook to read the notes for machine inspections. Another long day inside this hole, he thought. The eternity of radial tires squeezed like black liquid tubes between those steel drums, that raucous thrum. Sometimes Ivan wondered if the fumes were to blame for his persistent sore throat. Kate was a beautiful woman. He would always remember how his heart came up into his throat that day. She gazed out over the plowed field, both of them standing beside the tractor. How the wind blew softly against her blue cotton blouse and revealed the supple curve of her breasts, and the grace with which she swept her long hair from her face as she stepped over the dirt towards the house. He'd never seen brown eyes like hers. Usually brown eyes have a surface you can't see through, but Kate's reflected light as if they had water in them, the kind of eyes a man could get lost in. Private dreams. Across the bridge table, Ivan had been careful when looking at Kate. Even now, walking out into the gigantic space where blasts of machine rollers churned around him, he was fighting Kate's eyes. "Good morning, Ivan." "Buddy," another electrician yelled out across at him. "Things look pretty good for the moment." Ivan tipped his cap. "Good morning," he said, putting on his goggles and gloves, wondering about these tires, round and black, with their hidden interior that gives them their strength on the road. He'd vowed he'd never look at Kate again the way he had that June day after plowing. He knew how much Andy loved Kate. He'd witnessed it firsthand, like on that night a few weeks ago when he'd walked down to the wharf looking for his pocket knife he'd forgotten. It was already dark, and the moon hung like a big globe in the sky. Ivan heard a voice like he'd never heard before, deep-pitched, almost singing. He'd walked out onto the wharf, peered around the fish store, and there, sitting together with their feet dangling over the dock, were Kate and Andy. Andy holding a book in the air, black against the moonlight. Ivan tried to bring Kate into focus. Her head was slightly raised. Were her eyes closed? She seemed entranced. He'd lean back against the fish house and listen. "I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back. When the wind blows the water, white and black, we have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed, red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown." In the following silence, a profound melancholy overcame Ivan. He wasn't sure why. He didn't know much about poetry, but was moved by what he heard. It bothered him that Andy had never talked to him about poetry. Was it because he didn't have an education like Andy? Ivan realized there was a whole side to Andy he might never know. Often he had come to visit and found Andy reading, but he had never asked Andy anything about those books he read. All of the things missing in his life suddenly took hold of him. He loved that someone wrote about mermaids. He looked towards the reef that gleamed in the moonlight. Seals lived there, and probably now were sleeping. He heard the poem's last line, "Till human voices wake us and we drown."
Wow, you got everything into that passage. That scene. I mean, we get that, all that sensory detail about the factory where Ivan works, and how his brain is working and thinking about Kate while he's there at work. I think many people can relate to that experience. And then to bring in the poetry. I know how much you love poetry, and it's a treat to have that reflected in your characters too, the poetry and the love of books with the bookstore. So even though it's fiction, we know that some of your loves come through the characters and the setting. Well, this is quite a story in Shoal Water, and I'm wondering what it is that you would hope readers would take away from the story.
Well, I would hope they would take away, you can just go through the hardest things as a person. You don't know what fate is going to bring to you. You don't know what luck will come or not come your way. And I think it really is about characters trying to face the challenges and what they do to try to face those challenges, and to believe that they can get through some of the darkest parts of shoal water. That's the theme, the imagery of shoal water. That the irony of shoal water is it is very treacherous where the seafloor comes up close to the surface of the sea, but it's also where the richest fishing ground exists. So I think it's the learning that comes from experiencing those hard, dark places and the imagery in the sea. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It all fits together. So will we hear from Andy now? I think he's,
I started with Andy in
that's
the,
right.
yeah, at the very beginning. He went
That's true.
fishing with Ivan.
That's-
Yeah.
that's
I
right.
did see in the chat, someone wanted to see the poem. It's J. Alfred Prufrock, A Love Song, by T.S. Eliot.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Well, why don't I go to some of these other questions in the chat, because there are some really great ones. And if anybody would rather raise your hand, then write something in the chat. You can also do that. The bottom of your screen, there should be a little box that says reactions. And if you click on that, there's the raise hand option, and that will make it easy for Malia or me to see you and recognize you there. But first of all, Gretchen Wing asked, what brought you to Nova Scotia to begin with?
Well, it was after my experience living in Taiwan at during the Vietnam War. And then I ended up living in Cornell in Ithaca, New York. And I guess I should first say that I grew up hearing stories about Nova Scotia. My mother had relatives who lived in Bedeque, and her father died when she was young, and there's some of this in the book. And Nova Scotia was the happiest place she was as a young girl. And so I grew up hearing this, that was her happiest place as a child. And then I met at Cornell the father of my two daughters, who wanted to go to Nova Scotia to build boats. And he said, do you want to go to Nova Scotia? So some of this you can see does end up in the book. And I just had the automatic reaction, yes. And that is true. I mean, there's, it's so funny as a fiction writer. I'm sure all fiction writers have this experience where you take from what you've learned and what you've done, and then you fictionalize it with a collage of other people. So it is an example of my doing that. And so going to Nova Scotia just sounded almost like a natural. I barely hesitated. In fact, one agent who read my book said, why would a young 22-year-old woman who had a college education jump in a 1957 Chevrolet truck and just drive off to Nova Scotia? And I've always remembered that question. And I did. And I think it was a combination of things: disillusionment with our own country in the Vietnam War, seeking a better way of life, a whole new future. It was the hope and the desire. But Nova Scotia didn't feel unfamiliar to me because of my family background.
Yeah, that's great. You probably do have to repeat to people that, yes, some of the things in this book are based on my own experience or grew out of my own experience. And yet this is not a memoir.
Right. I do have a funny story because my friend Asha, I don't think she'll mind my saying this, she read one of my first drafts. And so I'm guessing it started with all the Nova Scotians, and then Kate and Andy came in much later. And because I changed the perspective with the Americans coming to Nova Scotia at the beginning, when she told me she read my book, she said, oh, Kip, you changed it to being all about you. And I thought, okay, well, I guess that's true. It was about me in that I was the American who came to Nova Scotia, but I definitely fictionalized her. That was I got her there, and then she turned to fiction.
So just remember that, folks, as you're reading.
Yeah, all fiction writers, beware.
So Nancy, you were brought up a really great question about the Nova Scotian language, and particularly the use of the word "not" at the end of sentences.
Yeah.
I wondered if maybe you could read one of those so we could hear it. If you got one that you can pull up. It took me a while reading the book to get the hang of that
That's interesting. Yeah.
particular characteristic of Nova Scotian dialect, I guess.
So the part of Nova Scotia I lived in was the South Shore of Nova Scotia. It was essentially Lunenburg, which was settled by German Protestants. And so the original people who lived there were Germanic and had heavy German accents. And that's kind of getting the line of their speech often ended with you or not. So you're coming down to the shore, not, or you're going over there with you. It's sort of like a term that is it's emphasis, but it grew really, I think, a lot. I was struck when I first moved there that a lot of the inshore fishing community, it was as if they had heavy German accents. And so it was carried down over, because the German settlers arrived in Nova Scotia in the 1730s. So that's how it got handed down. And there's a book that it's kind of like my Bible. It's called Rockbound by Parker Day. Anybody who's interested in reading stories from this part of the world, this is just a classic. Rockbound by Parker Day. And Rockbound is an island, and he writes about these characters. And he does use the real vernacular, and it's very difficult to read because you kind of, I mean, it took me probably 50 pages before I could swing in to their linguistic way of speaking. But I decided not to go that route. I almost did. I did take out some, I kind of regret it in a funny kind of a way, like a wharf in Nova Scotia is called a stage. And so many people, when they'd read one of my drafts, they'd say, what do you mean by stage? And I thought, I don't want the reader to keep asking questions about what things mean. So I took the word stage out, but I kind of regret it because it's the true word that the inshore fishermen use for the wharf. I just stuck with wharf. But
yeah, as a writer, you just have millions of decisions to make like that, don't you?
Yeah.
It's the story is really so important, but then when it comes to the really polishing it, those are the kinds of decisions that you have to make. And probably for every decision you make, there's at least one person who thinks you shouldn't have done it that way, and there's at least one who thinks that was the right thing to do. So you're as a friend of mine says, you're the decider.
Right. That's so true. It's this funny combination of trying to write enough so that you take the reader to a place and into the emotional experience of the character, but you don't want to write so much that you lock them in. You want them to be free with their own imagination. And so that was the fine line I walked constantly with my characters.
Taya Shifter asked if we know you fictionalized everybody in this book, but she wants to know, would some characters recognize themselves? Some people in Nova Scotia, in that village where you were, would they recognize themselves in this novel?
I don't, that's a great question, Taya. Thank you for asking it. I don't think they would. I actually sent the book to my close friend in Nova Scotia, and we raised our kids together and spent a lot of time together, Sharon McDonald. And she just sent me an email today. She finished reading it. And she said, it was so interesting reading this book because I recognize parts of people in your characters. That's how she put it. And she knew about the accident. She was struck by how I changed things. But no, I would not be able to. Well, okay, I take that back a little bit. My one character, Lena, is definitely based on my dear friend Hazel, who was the wife of the dory builder. But in the book, Lena is not the wife of the dory builder. She's Will's wife in the inshore fishing community. But I would say that when I wrote from the character's point of view, Lena, I saw Hazel. Verlene is totally made up. I worked in the Lunenburg Library and I worked with a lot of the different wives of the inshore fishing community. Verlene is a total hodgepodge, collage. And I myself worked at the old people's home called Harbor View Haven at the time. They called it the old people's home. Not a very pleasant term these days, not politically correct. So it's just I don't know, fiction is, it's just, you live in this sort of dream world, really, taking on one side from what you know and taking on another side from what you dream and imagine.
Yeah. So Nancy, you want to know if you lived in a house with a ghost in it in Nova Scotia. There's a ghost in the Tanner house, right? And so when you were living there, were you in a house with a ghost?
You know, at another reading, someone asked if I had been influenced by my living on Lopez, and if any of that came out in my Nova Scotia novel, because I actually started writing Shoal Water after leaving Nova Scotia. I got the idea in Nova Scotia, but I didn't start writing it. And the house that I lived in when I left Nova Scotia was my family farmhouse. And so, to full disclosure, I think my family farmhouse, which I think many of you are familiar with, was in the cousin's farmhouse, kind of served as the Tannard house. But there was an old deserted house at the end of a point just beyond inshore fishing village, but it had been totally deserted. No one had gone there to live. So I made up the whole thing about the Andy's family buying that land and buying the house and remodeling it. That was made up in that part. But I think the ghost kind of came from my own experience. I think the seal legend brought me the ghost, but the experience of the ghost exists on Lopez at the cousin's farmhouse. I'm revealing all my collage secrets.
That's why people come to author events. You get these goodies. It's like, you know, the director's talking after the film. So, you know, this is people's reward for coming out, and it's the bonus of, in addition to this fantastic novel, they're getting to hear some of the stories behind it. So we appreciate you being willing to share some of that.
It's actually fun.
Inshore fishermen, they are, you know, prime characters in the book, and that's a whole issue in Nova Scotia, at least where you were. Could you just describe a little bit what some of the issues were there?
So the inshore fishermen go out in their dories and they set their nets and they go out in the Cape Island boat, and they're inshore fishing. They aren't out deep. The continental shelf drags from the East Coast, and the inshore fishermen are the ones who capture the lobster, halibut, and it's a very delicate seabed. And what the inshore fishermen experienced in the late 60s, really, I'd say that's when they noticed the impact. Huge vessels dragging great big trawler steel pits along the scallop draggers along the seabed, destroyed beds of the continental shelf, which then destroyed the lobster fishing and the cod. The cod actually became extinct. And the inshore fishermen believed it was because of the scallop draggers that they lost their primary livelihood. While I lived in Nova Scotia, the actual fish plant had to close down because the cod fishery died, essentially. So it is truly another act of greed where the corporate world, instituted these huge scallop draggers that destroyed the bottom of the sea. And that was a major issue in the community.
Yeah. Well, something that is quite contemporary too.
Yeah.
Some concerns we have around here.
Mhm.
Molly Preston just wrote a beautiful comment in the chat, and I think it's the perfect segue for me. She said, Kip, I have just started this wonderful book, and I'm immediately struck by the beautiful writing. I hope this book can be widely read and enjoyed, as it deserves to be a bestseller. Brava, Kip. And so that's the perfect opportunity for me to put in a couple of plugs. One is your book is available at Lopez Bookshop. And are there still some signed copies there? Do you know?
I actually called today on your advice, Iris, and they only have one copy, but they said they'd be happy to order. So if you go in, they'll order. And I'm happy to sign. Just let me know if you'd like me to sign your book. I'd be happy to meet you and sign the book. Yeah. And it's wonderful to support the Lopez Bookshop.
Yeah. Hopefully they will order a quantity of them and you can go in and do another little signing event like you did when the book was first released.
Yeah.
And then when you read the book, all of you, something that a lot of people don't realize how important it is for you to write reviews on websites, bookseller websites like Amazon and Goodreads. And you can write the same review on both of those sites. And those really do have an impact on sales. So Molly, you could just write that right in your review on Goodreads and Amazon or any other place, any of you doing social media. Seriously, it does make a difference. Any of you who go into Lopez Bookshop know how many new books are coming out every week. And every little bit helps to bring attention to books like Kip's that, people really need to know about. So that's your homework after tonight. And Molly responded, she will do. So
thank you. And I learned something. I didn't know this. I knew it about bookshop.org, but Amazon apparently does give a percentage of their book sales back to the local independent bookstores. I don't know if this is just a recent thing. So I realized, a lot of people think Amazon is the big tiger, but my daughter Jenny will say, Mom, you've got to have a presence on Amazon. So I was very heartened to hear that, that Amazon is giving back to the independent bookstores. So please don't be afraid to order from Amazon.
It's like Nancy Ewert's hand is up.
Okay, go ahead, Nancy.
Oh, she's muted.
You're muted, Nancy. Nancy's muted.
She's working on it. She's talking to herself as she tries to unmute.
There she is.
Fine. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be monopolizing the evening, but you can tell I'm listening attentively. And I read the book with great attention. But I just wanted to make another comment, Kip, which is I often find myself, if I'm reading something that incorporates some mythological thing, like I'm so literal that that's hard for me sometimes in books. This was not the case. Every time the seal came in, I was like, oh, it just wove in. So it wasn't overpowering, but it just had this background, front ground presence that was really beautiful. And I just want to applaud the artistic endeavor that you accomplished by having that be so smooth. It was really, I mean, of course, I could talk about your book as long as you're talking about it, and I won't do that, but I will. I'll do that with you, Brian. But I did want to make that comment because I really, I was really struck by it.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I felt that way too. Whenever the seal appeared, I felt a sense of comfort because of what it conveyed. Well, Malia has reminded me that we have reached our hour. We've gone past it a little bit. So I'm afraid we're going to have to close for tonight. But I just don't know how anybody could resist reading this book after this wonderful conversation and these excerpts. And if you're like me, you probably will be up late tonight. If you already have the book, it's one of those that's hard to put down because you want to know what's happening next and you want to get to know these characters better. So again, Kip, many congratulations to you and thank you for bringing us this fabulous story. And again, Malia, thank you for your great work with bringing this to all of us. What a wonderful way to spend a windy, rainy, dark evening. So Kip, go ahead. You probably have some final word.
Yeah, thank you, Malia. It was very sentimental for me to come into the Lopez Library, and have this event through Lopez, our home and where I worked. It's very special. And Iris, you're stellar. You're amazing. Thank you for your questions. You held my hand through this whole thing. Thank you. I really appreciate your guidance in the interviews.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful presentation. Thank you.
And Malia, this has been recorded. So can you let people know when the recording might be available? Because we know there are some folks who really wanted to be here tonight and couldn't be. And so when might they be able to watch it again?
Yes, the recording should be available by tomorrow, and I'll send everyone who registered for the program a follow-up email with a link to that, and you can forward that to whomever you want in your networks.
Great.
Yeah. So
Thank
you everyone for coming, and I'm sorry that this couldn't happen in person, Kip. I know that would have probably been even more special, but perhaps some people are here tonight that wouldn't have been able to make it to the library, and we wouldn't have been able to host actually 75 plus people here. So
yes. Well, thank you, Malia. There's just the silver lining. I saw my college roommate's name, Allison Van Dyke, slide by.
Wow.
So I don't know if she's still there, but hi, Allison. She lives in Martha's Vineyard.
Yes, that is definitely
the silver lining. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, one more big congrats to you, Kip, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you to all. I so appreciate your support and coming and reading Shoal Water.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night.